Thanks very much, Dan. As Dan said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you all are in. My name is Kevin Elfenbein. Recently, I took the online course AidRobotics, Drones in Humanitarian Action. I thought it was, for me, a great learning experience and really interesting. I agree with Dan that it's kind of a good idea to share a little bit about what I learned. I'm not going to get into detail on any kind of specific things that are taught in the course so much as talk about mostly kind of generally what's in it and what my key takeaways and things I learned from it were. One other note, I definitely don't mind kind of answering questions or going into discussions as I work through this. So if anyone has questions or comments or thoughts or things to add as I'm walking through these slides, please feel free to jump in. So what I'll be talking about today, kind of a rough agenda, intro, I'll talk a little bit about who I am and kind of what the course was about, talk through some of my key takeaways for the course. The course culminated in a case study. So, each kind of participant has to pick a humanitarian drone operation and do a little bit of a deep dive on it, talk a little bit in detail about the what went well, what could be improved, those kinds of things, and then close out with if anyone has any remaining questions or discussion for the group. So introduction, a little bit about me. I am an American Red Cross volunteer, as Dan mentioned. I'm an ITT, IT and Telecom Emergency Response Unit roster member for the American Red Cross. However, I'm also kind of always looking to expand my deployable skills by training in IM, relief, logistics, kind of anything I can get into as much as I can to round out my skill set as much as possible. I'm very much interested in continuing involvement in drone working groups, the development of plans to use drones effectively as part of Red Cross and IFRC operations, hence kind of hosting this discussion and trying to work more with this group. As my day job, I'm an autonomous systems engineer. I focus on kind of software and integration work for collaborative drone fleets. One of the main projects that I have going on right now at my day job is collaborative drone fleets for power line inspection and infrastructure inspection. At this time, specifically focused on actually disaster response. So how do you use fleets of unmanned systems to basically figure out where you need to send people and tools to repair things as part of infrastructure after something like a hurricane. Outside of work, I am big into hockey. I play both ice and street and like to watch a lot of hockey. I'm also a hobbyist, multi-copter builder, flyer, tinkerer. I've built a couple of multi-copters and put some payloads on them and written different software for those things. And that's kind of an interesting hobby of mine on the side as well. Getting more into what the course was about. So this is kind of the rough outline of the course itself. I encourage, I had a good experience taking the course. It doesn't take a crazy amount of time, but does do a good job of kind of an overview of these topics. So if anyone is interested, kind of here's what the course covers at a high level: drone technologies. The hardware, what different kinds of drones exist and are used in current humanitarian operations. So obviously, multi-copter type vehicles, fixed wing type vehicles, VTOL vehicles, software and data pipelines. So getting into, when you're actually using drones to generate data, what do you do with that data? How do you collect the data, store the data, process the data to use for actionable decision making? Trends in technology, so kind of where things are going in the future as well. For humanitarian applications, Patrick, the man who runs the course, does a great job of talking through the different use cases for drones, including mapping, cargo, and kind of a number of different use cases that he gets into great detail on. Drone missions lessons learned. This is one of the, I thought, well, a lot of it was valuable, but I thought one of the most valuable pieces of the course for me, having never actually deployed in a drone usage capacity in a humanitarian operation, was kind of getting some of those key learning points and takeaways from actually running missions, the things that you wouldn't really be able to figure out unless you go deploy and go actually use drones in a mission environment. So planning and time management, how to best leverage tools and workflows, and the key lessons learned from a couple of different specific use cases. So I know as you go through the course, they talk about the Nepal operation and a few other very, kind of key or I guess high profile potentially operations where drones were leveraged as part of the operation, and kind of how they took lessons away from that and learned new things based on those experiences. Regulations and standards. So how do you keep drone operations safe? How do you comply with regulations at a variety of levels as part of operations? WeRobotics, the group that offers this course, they have a humanitarian drone code of conduct that I think really probably applies to a wide variety of organizations. A lot of it at least can apply to IFRC type operations. Data privacy and protection, another kind of sometimes lesser considered piece of drone related operations and data collection, but how do you make sure you're protecting and ensuring data privacy? And then the course closes with kind of a bringing it together module. So Flying Labs is a network that the WeRobotics team has built up around the world. It talks a little bit about their network and their approach to local capacity building, the importance of training and simulation exercises, and then kind of gaps and priorities that exist in the current state of the art and the way that drones are currently used in operations. So now I'd just like to get into kind of my key takeaways from the course. Like I said, I'm not going to walk through every category that was in that outline above. I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of what are the things that most impacted kind of my learning during this course. When are drones useful now? This was something they cover a good amount in the course, and I thought was really valuable to learn more about. Before getting into any specific use cases, the main thing to consider for using drones as part of humanitarian operations is, when would you use them? Anytime they would improve human operations. And that's not always the case. But sometimes if drones can actually reduce the time it takes to do something, whether that's gathering information in some way, whether that's getting items from point A to point B in some way, right? Reducing the time it takes to happen is a potential area where drones may be useful in an operation. Same with reducing risk to people or personnel, or reducing the resources required to do something. So the specific areas that drones are currently leveraged, currently used to do these things, reduce time, risk, and resources, are mapping and surveying. So assessing damage for scale and severity. This is one of the topics that they focus on for probably the largest chunk of the course, and is one of the most well understood and widely used applications for drones is this mapping and surveying capabilities. It kind of ties in a little bit with situation awareness and monitoring, but that's focused more on identifying changes in conditions and the changes in needs for an operation. So even things like looking at potentially population movements or kind of changes in conditions throughout affected areas can help direct, where resources need to go or where an operation needs to shift its priorities. Search and rescue is another pretty straightforward use case. So, can you use drones to get to places where it's very difficult or very dangerous for people to go to find civilians that may be in danger or need kind of immediate rescuing or immediate assistance, and then identify how to get resources there to support or help those people who need immediate assistance. Delivery and cargo. How can you use drones to more efficiently get items, whether it's medical supplies, relief kits, blood, testing kits, between different locations? Obviously after a disaster, a lot of times roads may be destroyed or closed, or even, as we'll see in a use case that I talk about later in this presentation, if there's kind of a region where there's a series of islands where it's not easy to just drive from point A to point B, drones can be really valuable in getting items, getting kits or cargo between different areas that are affected by a disaster or by where they need to move supplies around. And then the last kind of key use case that they talk about is the media. So being able to collect and provide information to stakeholders, to local community members, and to the public at large to help with, basically just getting information out about things, and also potentially using that information to try to get support for operations. Prior to taking this course, I'd done some thinking for my job and just as part of getting involved in drone work with the American Red Cross about, what goes into a drone operation. Obviously, I have not deployed on a drone operation, so this was a little bit theoretical. I'd like to change that someday. But kind of the key components of an operation going from top and then clockwise are planning, preparation, execution, and processing. And this kind of makes sense. You can read about this, online. It applies to not just drone missions, but kind of any type of mission. However, taking this course let me kind of do some deeper critical thinking on what goes into each of these phases of the mission. So as one of the outputs of taking the class, I was able to kind of hone in on, and this is still a pretty high level chart, but hone in on some specific questions to ask as you're going through each of these phases to make sure you set yourself up for the next phase as best as possible. So planning, that's a step that takes a lot of time. Prior to any mission where you might deploy with drones, there's a lot of planning involved in where you're going to fly, how you're going to fly, what limitations are on flying, what kind of hardware and software you need, and people and personnel to support the operations that you're going to do. Coordinating with local authorities, local organizations is all kind of part of that planning process to make sure that, if you're going to deploy to a disaster zone and use drones for something that's useful to an operation or beneficial to an operation, that you're not actually providing any hindrance to the operation, and that you can be kind of self-sufficiently running your piece of the operation smoothly to provide outputs for the rest of the operation. So kind of a key question coming out of that is, how do you effectively plan to make sure you run an effective operation and are compliant with any regulations, safety procedures, or other kind of parallel efforts that are going on as part of a larger operation? Obviously, there's a lot more details getting into those questions, but I wanted to kind of note at least the high level things to consider coming out of each of these phases. So planning leads into preparation, another thing that takes a lot of time as part of any humanitarian drone mission. So preparation includes, getting hardware together. That's kind of the really obvious one, getting software together, but also making sure you have, any kind of checklists, procedures laid out, people identified, and how you're going to leverage, the people that you have as your team for the mission and the processes that you're going to use. Making sure all of that is organized, making sure, you have things like spares, spare parts, backup procedures, safety procedures, training. All that stuff takes a lot of time, and the key is to make sure, how do you ensure you are fully prepared for the mission, including all those items: hardware, software, people, and processes. That way, as that preparation feeds into actually executing the mission execution is by far the least amount of time taken in an operation. And, I don't know the background of everyone on this call. I'm sure there are some people on this call who are looking at this like, yes, this is obvious. Maybe you've gone through this before, maybe you've done it. And for me, it makes sense mentally, but even just kind of hearing it in the context of some specific examples really drives home kind of the makeup of an actual mission and the time breakdown running through an actual drone mission. So mission execution takes the least amount of time. This is actually where, people are putting drones up in the air, flying them around, collecting the data that they need. One of the key questions to consider here is, how do you verify that you're collecting the right data to generate useful conclusions? Because that's really the key to any operation, as kind of drilled home by this course, is that you want the outputs of any of your drone missions to be useful, to be beneficial to the operation. So it's not the same across every mission, and sometimes there can be feedback loops built into this kind of general loop or flow of a mission, where every day you can look at the outputs of your execution time, and see what data was generated, see how that data has been processed, and whether or not it's generated anything useful for the operation, and then feed that back into the next day's kind of planning, preparation, and execution, to support collecting different data, or data in a different area, or data that will better support mission operations. Processing, so once you've collected all the data from executing the missions, actually generating the outputs to provide to decision makers and stakeholders. Another thing that takes a lot of time as part of the mission. And again, kind of day to day, but also after an entire mission. So at various timescales, we can consider how do you use the outputs of analysis and stakeholder feedback to improve future processes. Like I said, this could be future as in the next day or the next week, or future as in the next mission or the next year. So all these, I think, are kind of key questions that going through this course helped me solidify in my mind when thinking about drone missions themselves. Another thing they cover in the course are talking about some of the drawbacks and challenges. It's not always the right scenario to leverage drones for humanitarian operations. And even when it is the right scenario, there are a variety of challenges or reasons why using drones may not be great for any particular use case. So obviously a question to ask is, what are drones good for versus what are drones not good for? And one of the biggest challenges is, planning time and resources combined with limitations on usage. So, what that really drills down to is, for any given operation, for any given location, you need to be aware of the regulations and restrictions on flying drones to support any operation. So many countries have differing regulations on drone usage. They may change during times of disaster, or you may be able to get waivers or kind of exemptions based on the context of an operation that you're using drones in. But a lot of places kind of require strict compliance to local or kind of state or regional laws or regulations on drone usage. So all those have to be kept in mind when you're doing any sort of planning or preparation and mission execution. There also can be restrictions for any operation on, if an operation is using helicopters or other aircraft, or is within some range of a local airport, that may put increased limitations on when and where you can fly drones to support an operation. There's also limitations on using drones for operations based on environmental conditions. So kind of, a really great time to fly drones to deliver something or collect data would be during the day, when it's light out, in low winds, when it's a clear sky, and either no cloud cover, or clouds are not low cloud cover. That's definitely not always the case. And so, one thing that can limit the availability of drone usage for an operation is just, having to fly during the day. So having limited hours to fly. And then within those hours, it might rain for a part of the time. It might be gusting winds, high winds for a part of the time, and all of that kind of limits. Even if you have a great plan, you've prepared really well, you may not be able to even run your mission execution a lot of the time because of these other uncontrollable factors. Another piece that since I haven't deployed in this capacity yet, thought much about is community skepticism. So, there's been multiple drone operations as part of humanitarian responses where they've been met with skepticism by local communities. And this can be community leaders, or it can just be general members of the community who are seeing things that are going on, seeing people launch drones or fly drones around, and not fully understanding what the purpose is, what the technology is, what the, why they're being used or what they're being used for. And so, that can be kind of a limiting factor on using drones, a factor that can be mitigated, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides, but it is a factor that can make it more difficult to successfully leverage drones as part of an operation. Technological trade-offs, these are kind of the more obvious ones. So drones are not always cheap, so cost, reliability, range, how far drones can go, and training requirements are all kind of different challenges or drawbacks to potentially using drones as part of operations. And again, just really driving home here, right? Generating useful outputs. Drones should improve the operation. You don't want to hinder or impede an operation just so you can, fly some drones as part of it. Some of the considerations when actually executing or running a mission. Again, planning is the most critical component. There are some key pieces that I took from the course here. So only fly when you're invited and supported by local responders or national societies. This basically means if a disaster happens or a response is ongoing or an operation is starting up, don't just self-deploy with a bunch of drones and think it's going to be useful. Make sure you have a plan and have it worked out with the people on the ground who know the area the best, wherever the operation is. Get as much data beforehand as possible. So any maps of where you might fly, KML files, GIS information. Just set yourself up for success as much as possible by collecting the most data you can, or as much data as you can for planning and preparation. Rehearse missions if possible, and then have budgets, checklists, schedules, mission plans, all these things. In the top right, there's an example of a mission checklist. The Patrick Meyer, the man who started or basically put together this course, kind of drives home that one of the key differentiators in being able to tell before an organization that has drones even launches any drones, whether or not they will be an asset or a benefit to the mission versus a hindrance, is do they have really detailed, well-labeled checklists and schedules and budgets and mission plans? And if they do, it's not necessarily saying they're going to be successful, but it's a good indicator of if they don't have a thorough mission checklist, it's likely that they're going to be disorganized and not be a benefit to a mission or to an operation. Stay organized throughout the mission. There's a lot of data to collect. There's a lot of procedures to follow. So just kind of writing down everything that happens, saving off everything that happens, and having procedures for, saving, storing, processing data, directory structures, all that kind of thing really solidified beforehand will save a lot of time in the field and in post-processing. And then again, here's where I'm kind of coming back to engaging with the community. So always coordinate with local responders and as much as possible, build local capacity. It's not as beneficial to go into an area and provide drone support for an operation and then leave. Building that capacity, providing tools, trainings for local responders, for local organizations can really help kind of build the worldwide capacity for this. As we move forward with these kinds of operations. And this aligns perfectly with the IFRC and Red Cross approach to other kind of technological areas as well. Preparedness is a key part of making sure, without actually being on a mission, you're going to be successful on future missions. So train, keep training. One thing that, I've had some experience in other, not with drones specifically, but in other realms is with disaster and exercise simulations, which can help maintain skills. So this can include both technical skills, obviously, flying, data collection, analysis of the data, all those kinds of things. But soft skills are the piece that kind of the course opened my eyes a little bit more to that I hadn't been thinking about. So in some of the disaster simulations that Patrick and his team have run when providing trainings to local organizations is they'll split up a training group into, the actual drone mission group, and then another group to emulate the just operation as a whole leadership and stakeholders, and then a third group to represent kind of local government or authorities or air traffic control. And a key part of that disaster simulation is for the drone team to build up and exercise their soft skills. So communicating to try to figure out what data the operation needs, communicating with the local government and air traffic control actors to make sure they're complying with regulations and staying within their limitations to be able to fly and collect this data. Again, capacity building, just kind of reminding everyone about it again here, and legal and regulatory knowledge. So prior to any missions, just maintaining a repository of information about restrictions, waivers, or limitations for a variety of regions around the world or areas that are kind of high risk for deployment. Not that everyone has to memorize all of this off the top of their heads, but having that available for people to look at can be really beneficial for kind of knowing where to go if you're preparing to deploy somewhere to learn about the regulations, what you need to do in advance to make sure you're in compliance, and then while you're there to make sure you're in compliance for different regions around the world. And then last, maintain relationships with other organizations. That's probably not new to anyone and not limited to drone usage, but kind of that's how a lot of this obviously operational success happens. One thing that the course gets into later, and I've added a little bit of kind of my knowledge here, is where is humanitarian drone use going? One thing that hits close to home for me is the ITT related applications. So providing cellular, Wi-Fi, or other connectivity in the field on an ad hoc basis. You'll see the picture on the right is the AT&T Flying Cow, the cell on wings. I don't know if this is the exact one, but something similar to this has been used in, as far as I know, Puerto Rico within the last few years, and several other places to provide kind of ad hoc connectivity for either operational support or for local communities who need, connectivity to reach family members or to reach others in the wake of a disaster or some other event. Site surveying, so this is related to mapping or situational awareness, but when an operation is moving into a new location, drones may be useful in finding areas for setting up sheltering facilities, setting up field hospitals or other temporary infrastructure, and may be able to basically let the initial surveying happen, quicker than if people had to actually drive around to locate different areas where they may be able to put this temporary infrastructure. And the last one, autonomy and teaming. So right now, kind of at best, any of these types of operations have a 1-to-1 pilot to drone ratio, which is not really scalable, especially as you kind of may need to collect information over really large areas. It's going to take a lot of time for a single pilot to do that. Enabling one pilot to many drones by pushing off kind of the flight capabilities and control to the drones themselves, or multiple drones to coordinate with each other to cover larger areas, can really provide exponential benefits for many applications. As I mentioned, this is one of the things that I work on for my day job, and there's a lot of non-technical aspects to that as well that I'm just glossing over, regulations on that, limitations on that, other challenges. But it is where the technology is going. It may not be in the next 2 or 3 years, but over time, that will be something that's available to various types of operations. I know it's getting to 8:30, so I'll quickly walk through. The case study was kind of the closeout for the course. Everyone who takes the course has to do kind of a deeper dive into a single case study or humanitarian drone operation. I picked vaccine delivery between islands in Vanuatu. So this is a partnership between UNICEF, the Vanuatu Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Public Utilities, and then 2 separate drone companies. It went from 2018 into 2019, and the primary objective was to deliver vaccines and other medical supplies from central distribution centers to remote facilities. So Swoop Aero was one of the companies of the 2 to participate in this program. You'll see on the map at the bottom of the screen here, they had 2 hub locations on 2 of the different islands. And then this is where they kind of housed their drones. That's where the central medical facility was, where vaccines or supplies would get delivered prior to being distributed to the remote locations. The drone type they used is their Swoop Aero Kookaburra, which I think there's a new version of that now after a couple of years. But basically, they use these drones as part of this, I think, 5 or 6 month pilot program to deliver medical supplies to all of the orange or reddish spoke locations across the couple of islands. Wingcopter was the other company. They were on a different island based out of the hub location in Malsisi. They used their Wingcopter 178 heavy lift drone. And as you can see on the map off to the right, they basically delivered from this locations centrally on the island to a number of spoke locations scattered out towards the edges of the island. Overall, project evaluation. So Swoop Aero and Wingcopter, both companies were successful. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but they had almost 100% kind of delivery success rate. Now, obviously, it was a controlled experimental pilot program, but still, they were able to effectively work with the local government, work with the Vanuatu government in meeting the country's needs to adapt their UAVs and run these operations to deliver medical supplies and vaccines. They had a known and understood problem of reducing time and manpower needed, and they were able to successfully do that. And along the process, they created a lot of relationships with the local government, with the more regional governments, and with kind of local and regional healthcare responders as well. A couple of the challenges reported. So the main ones were communications and scheduling. Because of sometimes spotty cell service or other challenges, they had trouble coordinating at times. And so occasionally that would result in a delivery that was scheduled being canceled or delivery added at the last minute because they received a shipment in that they didn't expect, that they then had to respond to quickly because the supplies were, had a time limit on them effectively to get to their final destinations. Kind of the last part of this was asking about what happened with the with this project that we each studied after the fact. Unfortunately, it looks like there's pretty limited information on what, if anything, came out of the program. So this was a pilot program. There's very detailed and thorough reports that came out of kind of the operation of the pilot program and how it went, but kind of drops off after that. There's nothing indicating that this turned into a continuing program after the pilot. And so it's hard to say exactly, why that was the case, or whether there were other challenges that were unidentified or that made it, impossible to continue, or other reasons why it didn't continue. But it doesn't look like it's still happening to this day. I just had included a number of links that I used to gather the data for that case study. I can provide these to anyone who's interested. And then for questions and discussion. So I had some key questions that I thought we could use remaining time to discuss for the group. But before I talk to any of those, just want to open it up for a couple minutes and ask, does anybody have any questions for me on any of this?
Thanks, Kevin. That's been great. We have one question in the chat from Brent about the issue that you mentioned about one-to-one pilot to UAV not being sustainable when the regulatory authorities like the FAA currently don't really have any flexibility on that point. So how does the safety of flight issue and that not being allowed in many instances under regulatory frameworks?
That is a great question. So I had a brief note early on. I'll say I talked about this with Dan, that we may want, I will likely give another presentation sometime in the next few months about kind of current state of the art in industry, because that's what I work in. I will say it's a big challenge that hasn't been solved yet. Now, the FAA has granted a limited number of waivers for single pilot to multiple vehicle operations. Again, thus far, it's been in controlled situations. A lot of it is about mitigating risk. I mean, anyone who's flown kind of a modern drone, especially a multi-copter drone, knows that the pilot doesn't really need to do very much. You can basically program them to do, exactly what you want, and they are pretty reliable doing it unless conditions change. But in the regulation sense, there is no one size fits all solution for that right now. I'm only familiar with FAA regulations on that particular front and not other countries. That's kind of why I mentioned that is a much more longer term solution to actually be fielded in the real world, I think, because aside from just the technical challenges, there are the regulatory challenges that you'd have to work with any kind of government in any region you're going to be operating in. So it's something that the FAA is thinking about. I don't know about other countries. and it's something that you know, we as industry developers of that technology are also thinking about, but nobody has the full solution for it yet.